Okay, hello, my name's Dave White. I work at the University of the Arts London. This is a version of a talk I gave at the Postdigital Backlash conference, which was held in Zagreb in Croatia in June 2026. And broadly, the conference was looking at this sort of cultural phenomenon of the backlash against the digital environment, which I guess the most obvious example of that at the moment is governments like Australia and the UK looking to ban social media access for the younger generation. But in this talk, I'm talking about a backlash against AI, or one that I see emerging. So it's the phantom premise times two, because I think that there are two premises hiding in the backlash against generative AI that I want to go through. So on the surface, there's a backlash against AI because of the way that it threatens labour in various forms. So, you know, that can be seen past, present, future, whereby what the data that's used to train the models is stolen from labour that has been taking place historically, all the materials on the web, all the content and resources on the web. Present, whereby if you post something online, then you're wondering whether that's going to be taken and used to continue to train the model. And the future, which is the loss of potential work, partly because of the way that generative AI is a kind of technology of cultural production, or at least I find that is a useful way of thinking of it, in that it can, you know, with a relatively small amount of skill, you can use it to produce cultural artifacts. And certainly, you know, and what the standard of those are, the quality, where that's headed, that's an open question. But certainly, as someone who works at a creative arts university, we see a lot of anxiety around that. So this is a kind of surface backlash. It's quite immediate. But what I'm claiming is that there's something deeper going on underneath it. And you're beginning to see this backlash bubbling up, which is the backlash against generative AI being presented as if it were a person. So just to be clear, I don't think it is a person, but I think that some of the major sort of providers of generative AI are deliberately engineering the technology to make it appear as if it was a person, and to suggest, if not aggressively promote, that that's the mode of engagement, as if you were interacting with another human. But that isn't, that's kind of a false premise, and therefore a phantom. So just to be clear, I'm not specifically against AI as a technology. I think the underlying technology is fascinating, powerful, interesting, got loads of potential in terms of, you know, on the one hand, efficiencies, which I'm less interested in, but also there's a lot of sort of creative and intellectual possibilities with the technology. What I'm against is this sort of zero-sum future that I've written about, which is being presented by largely that sort of narrative coming out of Silicon Valley. Okay, so it's not the technology in essence, but it's the way that it's being wrapped up and packaged and sort of sold to us, both sort of technologically and also almost sort of philosophically as well. And the person aspect of it is part of that. So this is something I wrote about in 2024. This is my deliberately awful model of what I think's going on, or not what I think's going on, but what I think we're being sold, which is there's this idea that humans can do certain things, right? Certain types of work, certain acts of production or creativity, and the technology, as the technology gets better, it cuts more and more into that space, and therefore what it means to be specifically human in a way that's distinct from the technology, and this is just one model of thinking about the relationship between humans and technology, but there it is. What's happening is that the technology is gradually sort of eating into what it means to be human, and so what it means to be human gets smaller and smaller and kind of pushed into the pointy bit of this triangle. I don't think that's really how it works, but I think that's the sort of cultural imaginary that we're in. That's certainly the dominant space. And I think in terms of a backlash, whether we're sort of explicitly conscious of what's going on there, we can feel it. It makes us claustrophobic, and there's this general discourse, and you can kind of see it getting stronger and stronger at the moment, that actually, you know, what it means to be a human is something distinct and special. And just because a technology can do something, can simulate something a human can do, it doesn't make a human any less, if you like. And it also doesn't make the technology any more human in of itself. And what fascinates me, so this comes from a paper from a couple of years ago where all of the various metaphors that people were developing as a way of sort of coming to an understanding of generative AI and helping to explain it. And, you know, metaphors are a really, really useful way of getting into an emerging subject and coming up with a sort of sense-making that subject and coming up with a narrative. But what I found fascinating was that nobody'd really proposed person as a metaphor, right? Because what's happened is that idea of the technology being engineered to operate as if it was a person is kind of so close to us, it's so sort of all-pervading that we can't see the wood for the trees. We've forgotten that that notion of person in terms of how the technology is constructed and how we engage with it is a myth or a metaphor. And as we know, some people do engage with the technology as if it was a real person. And that has all kinds of complicated and potentially really negative effects. So, you know, what I'm saying here is I think the single most powerful metaphor that is knocking around at the moment within and around the technology is this idea of the technology as a person. And one of the reasons that it's powerful is because we're not actually thinking of it as a metaphor. We keep forgetting. Okay, and we keep anthropomorphizing the technology. That's what we do. We're good at anthropomorphizing things. We're kind of vain that way. We come to an understanding of various things that are non-human through the lens of humanness, right? And sometimes that's useful, and sometimes it can get out of hand. I'd say that's what's happening at the moment. And so, you know, as an example of a way of balancing that out and trying to create a sort of useful critical framing that can help us sort of step back for a moment and think about how we're using the technology or hoping to use the technology. I led with a whole bunch of colleagues across my university on the development of these AI principles. And as you can see, number 4 there, which actually people respond to really, really positively. You know, it seems like such a straightforward thing to say, but actually seeing it written down as a sort of set of institutionally ratified principles, I think people find it, it gives them a little bit of confidence and gives them a bit of, maybe people feel like they've sort of scrabbled back a little bit of their agency when they look at these principles and use them to think through how they're engaging with the technology. Number 4, think of AI as a machine, not a person, right? Now, that's not to say that you couldn't build AI into processes successfully as if it were a person, but you'd have to remember that it's not a person. And I would argue that's genuinely difficult to do, right? So when a technology comes along that is so good at simulating natural language, that it is very good at doing that, right? And so it's really hard to encounter something that is simulating language at that level of quality, if you like. The simulation is accurate, let's say. It's difficult to encounter that without immediately kind of snapping into the idea, well, it must be a person. So Phantom 2 is to do with this idea of hyperreality. So I'm very bad at pronouncing this name. Baudrillard, this guy wrote this famous book, Simulacra and Simulation, and he talks about the way that the image has shifted over time from representing a reality. So for instance, let's think about like a traditional photograph of a landscape or a person. That image is a reference to the reality of that moment, if you like, but there was a moment that existed that has been captured and created or made into image. He's saying that actually what's happened is that over time the image or the media that we engage with has gradually become self-referential and no longer has a kind of anchor point or a lightning rod down through to reality. So everything we encounter, and I'd say something like AI slop is a really, really good example of this. Everything we encounter in the digital environment, or the majority of it, doesn't reference any kind of reality that you could wire back through to. It's just referencing another reference, another reference, another reference, and so it goes round. And this is what he means by hyperreality. Now, sometimes this is mistranslated as there's a kind of real world that, if you're smart enough, you can see it, and then there's a simulated world that the rest of us fools are living in and we're too stupid to notice it. So this is this classic red pill, blue pill thing. But actually, when you look at the theory, because this book is referenced, or there's a brief shot of it in the film The Matrix, where this whole kind of red pill, blue pill manosphere stuff appears from. If you look at the theory correctly, then essentially what he's saying is that when you encounter something as a hyper-real state of media or image, the fact that it exists in this hyper-real state indicates that the thing that it's referencing no longer exists, i.e., as I was saying, you can never wire it back to something real. Everything's hyper-real, everything is referencing something, as I say, in that kind of loop or soup, if you like. And so in that sense, and I'm not going to go into the detail on this, the red pill is just another blue pill, right? And relative to the phantom premises that I'm talking about and the backlash, I think what's happened with generative AI is because it presents itself as person, it means that now, and quite suddenly, we can't wire what we engage with online and in that kind of media environment, if you like, in the networked environment. We can't find a way back to a person, right? So up until this point in history, even if something was like super postmodern and a reference of a reference of a reference of a reference, you could still think it through and you go, yeah, but a person has written something that is reference and reference and reference, or a person took that photograph, or somebody videoed someone doing something that has then been converted and reference and reference. So you could kind of square it with yourself. You could kind of find your way out of sort of pure hyperreality by trying to go back through and find the human that was kind of at the end or at the start of that chain. Now that generative AI can simulate a person, as I say, it's not a person, but now it can quite successfully simulate a person either in text or video or audio, suddenly everything is pure hyperreality. You don't know whether something's a person or not a person anymore unless you're literally staring at the computer that was made on at the time, right? And so that creates this really sort of uncanny environment whereby you can't find your way out of this sort of pure hyperreality. And I think that causes a sort of weird, uncomfortable kind of sickness in us in some senses, because we have this, I would argue, kind of innate sense that things are unreal, that the people that we're encountering are no longer people, right? And Mark Fisher talks about this, the idea of the weird and the eerie. So he makes the point that the eerie is something that appears to be a person, but you know it's not a person, right? Or it appears to not be a person, but you know it's a person, right? A lot of horror movies are based around this. It seems to be a very deep-seated human thing to respond in this way, to have this sense that something's a bit off, right? And so you try and square that by going, oh, okay, but maybe if I go back another couple of layers, I can find the puppet master or the creator or the writer of what I'm encountering. and that is the real person, and then everything's okay. What I'm saying is, because of generative AI acting as if it was a person, and it being a reasonably successful simulation of a person in some terms, whilst not being a person, which I'm, emphasizing repeatedly here, that means that we become unsettled because it's like encountering the eerie. So we're in this sort of almost 100% saturated hyperreality, because so much of our lives are mediated through screens. So much of our lives are lived out within the digital environment and through screens, that it means that we can't find our way out of this kind of sort of eerie hyperreality where until recently you'd be able to go, yeah, but there's a person in there somewhere. Now you're engaging with it and going, I don't know if it's a person or not a person. And we're pushing back against it. We don't like it and we don't want it because it really resonates deep down with like long-standing sort of psychology and philosophy of what it means to be human, in that it's really important to us that we understand what's a person and what's not a person. And when that gets messed with, we find it uncomfortable to the point that we want to push back against it. So I'd argue that that's really, really compelling. And what's interesting to me is the way that, some of our younger students that are coming out of school and into university, so they might be 18, 19, 20, I'm beginning to see that they're some of the most nostalgic people within culture, within our society at the moment, because as a friend of mine, Peter Bryant, points out, they can remember when generative AI didn't exist. They didn't necessarily ask for it, they didn't necessarily want it. Doesn't mean they're not interested in it. But nevertheless, they've got this ability to remember before generative AI and after generative AI. And actually, what I suspect is happening is that this backlash or pushback against generative AI that I see is it can be in the form of resistance or in the form of refusal, and it operates across a number of different sort of thematic areas. It might be the ethics of the way that the models are trained. It might be to do with energy use and climate. It might be to do with biases in the data. It might be to do with the use of AI to automate judgments in a way that is punitive. So, like abuses of using the technology to perpetuate certain forms of asymmetrical power. But also there's this sort of thing hiding in it, which is I don't want something that's pretending to be a person because I know it's not a person, and that doesn't seem right, and that's just weird and creepy, and can we not? And the response to that is actually a form of nostalgia. So I think resistance and refusal tends to play out as a wish that the technology had not been invented. Can we just go back to before? And you see that as well with generations that are younger than myself, for example, romanticizing a kind of pre-internet era when life was simpler. Certainly in my experience, when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, it was the older folks that would be nostalgic and would be saying, why is the world so complicated? Can we just go back to a simpler time? Now we see quite a powerful narrative coming from a younger generation, which is being played out as this backlash against the digital, this quite powerful sort of nostalgia and a desire for things to be uninvented. Now, what doesn't help is that some of the sort of mainstream Silicon Valley companies that I'm not going to list off here because we all know who they are, they use this convenience whereby they sort of imply that things like emergent technologies like generative AI, there's a kind of inevitability to them. And I think, part of the backlash is against that narrative of inevitability, because it's convenient to be able to say something, a technology has been sort of discovered as if it was always going to happen through the force of history rather than invented. Because obviously if it's been discovered, not invented, then whoever has actually invented it rather distances themselves from the responsibility of how that technology, as I say, is being packaged and sold and how it plays out. Because you can go, well, that's just a naturally occurring phenomenon. Okay, so let's talk about actually using generative AI and how some of these sort of phantom premises sort of play out when within the process of making or creating work in conjunction with, not in collaboration with, but when using generative AI. It could be text, image, video, audio. I'm being quite deliberately broad here. And so in my context at the University of the Arts London, the idea of creative agency and intention, so you might have noticed that was the first principle, was stay in control of the process, be intentional about what you're doing. That is incredibly important. And one of the reasons is because we're sort of at least as interested, if not more interested, in the intention of the student when they were making the work than we are in the work that they actually finally create. Okay, so in our marking criteria, there's 5 different assessment criteria that we've got. One of them is realization, which is the thing that you make, and the other one is process, which is your ability to reflect on, articulate and theorize the kind of the journey of how you reached that realization or output. Okay, which makes that whole process becomes distinctly educational and is if done well, is assessing learning rather than assessing a kind of polished, finished product necessarily. And so agency becomes really important. Now, so I'm going to talk about that for a second, and then I'm going to loop it back to the problem of the technology as person, and that being a kind of phantom premise, along the lines of this talk. And it's the idea that, so one model of agency is that it's like willpower, if you like. It's desire. It's something that is distinctly outside of the technology. A technology doesn't really have the desire to create or make. It always has to be. I mean, the point is with generative AI, it might be very powerful, but somebody has to prompt it. And even if you're talking about agentic AI, still somebody had to design all of that and start it running, if you like. One of the things that's really distinctly non-technological, you could say human, but it extends to the sort of the animal kingdom as well, and some people might extend it to plant life as well, is that there's a sort of an innate desire to connect and create, which is really fascinating and kind of, I'm not going to say magical, but it's I don't know. It's certainly not specifically algorithmic or mathematical. It's something beyond that. Each their own on that subject, right? But anyway, one model is that drive, that agency to make work and to learn comes from within, and it's like a kind of drive from within the person. But Karen Barad, who is a quantum physicist who's theorized a lot of this stuff, talks about the idea that agency doesn't come from an individual source, but agency, that desire, that sort of making things happen, comes from when two things interact, but she uses the term interact, okay? And so agency comes from the actual action of things interacting, okay? I'm trying to get that right. And so that's integral to this idea of the post-digital, whereby rather than saying there are humans and computers and they're distinct and a human uses a computer, it's actually more complex than that, which is that actually humans and technology are entangled with each other, And it's through all these interactions in that entanglement, in this sort of complicated way that technology and humans are kind of wrapped around each other, that's where the agency is generated from, okay? Now, my point in the context of this talk is that that agency won't be generated if what you're interacting with is actually a myth or a phantom. So if you're using generative AI and your mode of engagement with it is sort of either explicitly or tacitly assuming that the AI is a person rather than a simulation of a person. So if you're assuming it's effectively another human being, then you're not really interacting with anything, because you're trying to engage with something that is a myth or a metaphor, right? And therefore, no agency will be generated from that entanglement. And, well, so what's the net result of that? And you might have experienced this yourself. You can use generative AI to generate work, and you can stay intentional in that, but sometimes what happens is that you're not confident that the work is your own. You're like, whose work is this? Who's really authored this? I don't, you know, and you get this sense that you've lost some of your self-determination. You've lost some of your agency, is one way of looking at it. This way of theorizing it would say, well, actually what's happened is that you might just have not generated any agency because that interaction is one that isn't quite what it should be, okay? So I think what can happen, and this is the risk with the sort of phantom technology as person proposition, which is how the technology, some of the, you know, one of the dominant ways that the technology is currently being formulated and presented. The risk is that you become enchanted with the technology rather than entangled with it, and therefore the work that you do, the things that you create within that entanglement with the technology, within, as I say, the interaction, feels sort of hollow. I mean, going back to the Mark Fisher stuff, there's a sort of eerie character to the work itself, right? It doesn't have the aura, and this is like a specific term that is used around certainly creative outputs. It doesn't have that sort of authorial aura that you feel when you encounter a really strong piece of work. And I think part of that aura, that sense that you get when you see the original form of a piece of work, as opposed to an image of an image of an image, or a reference of a reference of a reference. You know, when you have an encounter which is not hyperreal, I think the reason that can sometimes be compelling and feel meaningful is because you're sensing the genuine personness coming through the work, right? So the work itself is an outworking of the humanness of the creator or the author in that case, right? And again, it's a little bit like I was saying earlier, we have this sort of innate sense of something's a bit off when something is simulating being human. Even if the simulation is really good, as I was saying, it just feels slightly uncomfortable and strange and eerie. In the same way, when we encounter work that it's really difficult to kind of, you know, where has that work come from? Who's really the author of that work, especially if we generate it ourselves? Sometimes it's missing the person, the aura of the work. And you know, and I'm not trying to be spiritual or theological here. I think really what I'm saying is we have a very, very powerful sense of what it means to be human, and we are very sensitive to when we encounter humanness elsewhere, and if that's a bit off, then we feel it, right? So that doesn't mean that everything that is simulated or created by technology is necessarily not good work, strong work, meaningful work. But I think that work that sort of pretends to be something that it's not, we sense that, and it's uncomfortable. And you know, that's difficult if you're a student. It's certainly difficult if you're a student at my institution and you use the technology in that kind of, as if you're dialoguing with a person and work is generated. I think a lot of our students don't feel like they have that much ownership over that work. And for some of our students, they will then back away from using generative AI because they'd much prefer to take the sort of harder route that has more friction to it, is more difficult, perhaps is less efficient, but whatever, that process is something that they entirely own for themselves. They can claim that as their work. They are the author, the instigator of it. They have retained their intentionality throughout the process. And I would say, because of the nature of the interaction with whatever they're using, it's actually generating more agency. So by the end of the process, they feel like they have more, not less agency. And there's a sense that you've progressed, you've learned, you've grown as a person, right? So, you know, on the one hand, it's teleological because you produced an output, but on the other hand, it's ontological because you've kind of grown as a person, perhaps into an identity that's something that you're interested in. Like, I don't know, being an illustrator, being a graphic designer, being a fashion designer, or something like that. You can sense that you're becoming that person that you want to be because of the nature of that process. Whereas, if you're operating, if you're using technology that is simulating person, then perhaps some of that is lost, and some of that is because you've done that thing that a lot of people are talking about, where you've sort of cognitively offset perhaps the effort. But I would also argue, the case I'm making here, it's also because that technology, you might have been engaging with a sort of phantom persona. So where does that leave us? Well, there's something important going on. I just want to really reinstate. I'm not, as I said at the start, I'm not fundamentally against this technology. Absolutely not at all. I wouldn't be thinking about this so deeply unless I found the technology interesting and didn't think that it hadn't, you know, I do think that it's got these amazing potential. It's just fascinating, right? And you know, one of the things that's really fun about this as a subject area, or interesting, is that I think if you engage with it sincerely, then the question, you know, you think you're asking, what can you do with AI? But actually you're asking, what does it mean to be human, right? And that's a big and long-standing question. So one of the most positive things that comes out of all of this for me is it's creating a space where we are really re-engaging with that question in a way that perhaps we haven't done so much in recent years because of a kind of, you know, move to secularism, whereby that question seems less legitimate to answer, to explore, because we're not going to answer that question, let's be honest. It's only something that we can navigate. It's not something that, you know, converges on a specific answer. Let's just be clear about that. But you know, I think when something appears within our culture that is simulating, you know, it's basically going, look, I'm basically like a human, or at least it's being sold on that basis, our immediate reaction is to go, is it though? That seems a bit weird. And then that immediately leads you on to, yeah, but what does it mean to be a human? Because I'm pretty convinced that being a human isn't just what's left over once technology has done all of the things, right? So I'd say that for quite a lot of us, whether that's, you know, whether professional academics, students, are you know, at least some of the time in this sort of abject state, because there's a sense that because the technology is everywhere, because we're in this sort of post-digital condition whereby, you know, so much of our lives are mediated through the networked environment and through the digital and through screens, as I mentioned earlier, that it means that a new emergent technology can proliferate or be distributed incredibly quickly. So suddenly a technology like generative AI is everywhere and in your lives and on all your devices, whether you chose for it to be there or not, right? Because as somebody pointed out at the conference, the digital environment is a corporate environment. It's not a civic environment in that sense. So we're living out our lives in an environment that we don't have very much control over, which is why I think part of the backlash, governments are trying to get their hands around that environment a little bit more. And so there's a sense that I really should be using this, otherwise I will quote unquote fall behind. And I've been told that this is the next big thing, and it's really powerful and it's really useful. But in very non-specific ways. I've been told that in very non-specific ways. So there's a sense that you should be using it, and most people are using it in some form. But there's also that creeping underlying sense of like, maybe this is sort of undercutting what it means to be human, or my own sort of agency and my own intention. There's a lot of discussion of, in various forms, whether it's in sort of mainstream discussion or in research, that perhaps using generative AI a lot, like if it becomes habitual, might have a negative effect on your sort of ability to think critically and things like that. So people, I think everybody has a kind of sense of that. So there's this real tension, which is, I really ought to be using it because it's AI, right? Reminds me a little bit of the mid-90s when everybody wanted a website. And I used to hand code websites, and people would say, I really need a website, and you'd go, why? And there'd be a pause, and they'd go, because the web, right? And they weren't necessarily wrong. They might have needed a website, but nobody could really articulate why, because the technology has proliferated faster than culture could kind of wrap itself around it. See this with AI again, right? And so there's that tension between using it for all of those reasons, but also feeling like it's sort of having a sort of slightly corrosive effect. And more I hear staff and students talking about notions of shame and guilt, right? So they feel like they have to use it for various different reasons, but they're uncomfortable. And that's not good. Like, we don't, like, being in an abject space, being in an abject state is just, it's miserable, right? And so we need to find our way out of this somehow. Now, this is what I've done in this talk, is outlined some of my ideas about what's generating that abject state. And as you could probably tell, my main point out of this, or the main kind of response to this line of thinking, would be that if we removed the technology, if we took away that kind of attempting to simulate a person from the technology, then a lot of these problems, I think, move to one side. There's all sorts of, again, alluded to this before, there's all sorts of other difficulties around the ethics of the technology, and the questions around climate and the business model and all the rest of it. But then on the other hand, we see, and again in the middle of 2026 as I'm recording this, so on the other hand we see quite a lot of activity around like local models that just run on a laptop or on an isolated computer, and a range of those local models, some of which have been, you know what they've been trained on, and you can track the energy usage. So there are, I guess this is where I'd want to finish. I've outlined these sort of uncomfortable and problematic aspects of what's happening at the moment because of the way that the technology has been formulated and how culture is kind of responding to that, which is in some cases a form of backlash. I guess what I'm claiming is that we're probably not yet clear on what we're backlashing against. So my point is we're backlashing against a kind of something that's claiming to be human that isn't human. So yeah, some of the companies that really have the money to invest will continue to make the technology better, by which they mean it's more and more like a person, and these effects that I'm describing I think will get worse and worse. On the other hand, there are multiple possible futures, right? The future is not written, and that zero-sum version of the future that is dominant at the moment, whereby we feel our humanity getting squeezed into a smaller and smaller corner, I think that might break, you know? I mean, I think both things will exist in parallel with each other, but I can see the alternative futures where we engage with the technology in ways that aren't fundamentally about the technology simulating a person. I can see them becoming more powerful and more popular. So, you know, fundamentally, this is where I want to finish. I would suggest that the dominant way that the technology is being formulated is, and others have said this around creative work, but it is an insult to our humanity. And whilst we might, whilst for some people, their most immediate sort of sense of something being off is to do with the idea of labour being stolen, that actually I think in the mix is the sense that the way that the technology is being formulated by some folk is actually an insult to our humanity, and we feel that. So I just want to finish with my sort of different model of what it means to be human, where you turn the triangle the other way up, and actually what happens is, so this is Bloom's taxonomy, which is a kind of taxonomy of learning, which is pretty old, and there are pros and cons to it, but it's normally, the triangle normally has the pointy bit at the top. If you turn it the other way around, then create goes out to infinity. So just to end on a sort of note of pro-human hope, I think that, done thoughtfully and in a human-centered way that isn't just about trying to accrue power, there are plenty of forms of being entangled with the technology that further what it means to be a human, and that what it means to be human is not something that is fixed, but it's something that is always changing and progressing. And sometimes it's progressing in a good way, and sometimes it's progressing in not such a good way. But it is not finite. It keeps on evolving and progressing, and technology, done well, in my opinion, can be part of that.